Well, hello everyone. I'm Father Alexander, up here all the way in Sewanee, Tennessee, on God's holy mountain at the University of the South.
And I'm on God's holy sandbar called Longboat Key in Southwest Florida. And there is a pretty major system off of our, just off the coast. And I was telling Alex that it is headed straight towards his home in St. Petersburg to get a whole bunch of rain. When I say system, it's just a bunch of rain. But come on out to the island. The fishing is amazing, especially when these low pressure systems go by. The snook, they're out running on the beach. It's great. So, and the other benefit, and Alex, you and I haven't talked about this, about coming out to a barrier island after we get these series of storms through, is that the shells that get washed up onto these white sandy beaches, it's a great time to go collect your favorite shells. But I'm Dave Marshall, rector of All Angels by the Sea, Longboat Key, and I
And
am
this,
happily Alex's friend and an Episcopal priest. And today is a bridge between, where we will talk about our knowledge of the gospel. And today, the gospel is going to take place in the Hebrew scriptures. So we're going to be looking at First King. Alex, how
and
you doing?
this is one of my favorite passages. Like, I'm sure it's for most people, a lot of people love this particular passage from the Hebrew Scriptures.
Okay. And why do you think people like this passage? And first of all, you and I know what the passage is. No one else does. This is a
Right.
big mystery. It's First Kings chapter 19.
Yep.
And if that doesn't mean anything to you, one of my favorite characters, Elijah, the prophet, the
Yes.
greatest of all prophets. You don't
That's a
mind me
hot
saying
take. That's a
what?
that's a hot take. All right.
Yeah, you don't think he's the? Okay, because he is. Well, he's representative of all the prophets.
Okay.
Moses
Well, yeah.
is
Okay. Yes.
representative of the law, and
Yeah.
Elijah is like when they Jesus said, "Who do you say I am?" Some people say you're Elijah, right?
Okay. You know what? Not a
They
hot take.
didn't. They
I'll
didn't
give
say
you that.
some people say you're Hezekiah or Zephaniah or no. They went right to
Joel.
Joel. Hey, I love Joel. You know, gotta give a shout out. Some people say you're Hosea. Anyway, so that's
So it's the story of Elijah running for his life after he's killed all the prophets.
what prophets?
Wait, how did he kill all the and how he killed all the prophets with the sword? The Jezebel's prophets.
Uh, yeah. So let's be very careful with that
Yeah,
word.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, because in English we lose. There are we would call them in Greek pseudo or false prophets.
correct.
So don't think that Elijah is the greatest prophet because he went out and killed all the other prophets of God. No,
Yeah, no,
that these were the ones that were trying to say that there is a false God out there. And so, yeah, Elijah went out and did this amazing work. And then what happened?
and then he needed to go run for his life, and so he ends up in the wilderness. And
Why did he have to go run for his life?
well, because Ahab had told Jezebel what Elijah had done,
Okay.
right? What it says there.
Ahab's the king. Jezebel's
Ahab's
his
the
wife.
king, right?
Yep.
And he did not. They did not appreciate what Elijah had done.
Right.
So,
Right. Because all of their clerics or their ministers or whatever
mhm.
have been wiped out. So, why do you think Elijah, with all his great power and everything that God was doing in him, what happened? That he went out and did this thing, and
um, I, I
then
I think that sometimes one of the things that happens is, and I'm going to make a very not a strange analogy, but I think I'm going to make a direct analogy here with something that happens in the Gospels. Is we can see the miraculous, we can experience the miraculous,
right?
and as human beings, still come back and say, "Well, that was just a one-off. Like God is not going to work again."
Yeah.
Kind of like Peter sees Jesus walking on water, calls out, "He's walking on water," and then he starts to doubt. It's like, why did you doubt? You
Hmm.
were doing it.
Okay. Can we go a little deeper?
Well, hopefully not Peter, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Ministry burnout.
Okay. Okay,
Okay.
I see that. Yes.
The
Yes.
story is often used when talking to clergy about ministerial burnout, that Elijah had done these incredible things, and then, and he's tired, and suddenly he finds out the king is mad and they're going to go get him. They want to kill him. And he suddenly is surrounded by fear and runs.
And the fear, it's not that the fear isn't real. I mean, there are
Mm.
actually people chasing him.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
the problem is that the fear overtakes him. That's really the problem. And in his case, when he runs, I still love, God asking like, what are you doing here?
yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
what are
he
you
went a
doing?
day's journey into the wilderness and he sat down under a solitary tree and prayed to God, "It's enough now. Take my life. I'm no better off than my ancestors."
Yeah.
And yeah, and then an angel of the Lord. So for the Episcopal clergy who are preaching on this passage this Sunday,
Mhm.
um, I'm reading from a section you can remove. You don't have to use it. But at all angels, anytime there's a reference of an angel, you know we're going to use it.
Yeah.
And so the passage that you can remove is where an angel touched him and said,
Yeah.
"Get up, honey, and eat."
Well, it's
That's
also
how I think the angels speak, by the way.
well, the thing is that I remember when I remember reading not a a Facebook commentary on this, we'll call it,
A
is
Facebook
that
commentary. I didn't
is
know
that
Facebook did such a
somebody posted something about this where they said, never forget that before God really talked to Elijah and asked him what he was doing,
yeah.
that he got a meal and a nap.
Yeah. And then well, he actually had two naps. And then the angel touched him again and said, "Honey, get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." And so he got up and ate and drank again. And then he had strength for 40 days and 40 nights. That's odd. What other passages in scripture have we heard somebody not eating for 40 days or 40 nights?
That
Hmm.
Jesus guy.
That Jesus guy,
Yeah.
right? When he was out in the wilderness for 40 days, and then he comes back and Jesus says, who do people say I am? Elijah? Like this is where it comes from. So, and
Now,
then you said, the Lord said to him, what are y'all doing here, Elijah?
exactly. And the thing is, Elijah gives good reason why
Yeah.
anybody might make a run for it. He says, I've been
Yeah.
very zealous for the Lord. Hey, I've been doing your work, man.
Hmm?
You know, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant,
Hmm?
thrown down your altars, and killed your people with the sword.
Yeah.
I alone am left. It's just me.
Yeah.
And it's almost screaming, and I'm not enough.
Oh, it is. Right.
It is
Yeah.
screaming, I did my best.
Hmm.
It wasn't enough, so I came back home.
Yeah. I alone am left.
Hmm. And they are
Yeah.
seeking my life now. Now they're coming after me personally.
Right. Right. Yeah. To that, I don't think he's that worried about that. I think it's really the I alone I'm left, that, the sense that I'm alone. Um, and, but there's nobody there to protect him.
Well, that's what he believes.
Well, right.
I mean,
Right.
that's what, and this is where I think it's so important that the next passage, for when we talk about the next passage, that we have this context,
Hmm. I
because
completely agree.
in the next passage we have this very iconic moment of God demonstrating God's presence. And the first time that I really understood this passage, well, sorry,
So Linda right now is like, tell me the passage.
oh,
So would you
oh,
like to
do you want
read
me to read
it,
it?
or do you want me to read it?
I'll read it.
Okay.
So God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus."
Very good. Thus ends the reading.
Thus ends the reading. So, what's interesting is this particular passage kind of got a different context for me when I watched a miniseries called The Nativity.
Okay.
And it's about the Nativity, it's about the birth of Jesus. But there is a moment where a mother is telling this particular story to her child, and they're quoting each other. They're quoting
Okay.
it to each other because they both know it. So I
This
just
story,
thought
the story of Elijah
the
and the
story of
mountain.
Elijah in
Okay.
this
Okay.
particular
Yeah.
passage. And so I think it's important that we need the other verses that come before this to really put this into context.
You bet.
Because Elijah's saying, it's just me and I'm running for my life. I had to come back here. I had to get away.
Hmm.
And God to me is saying, I was with you the whole time.
Hmm. Good. Um, what do you take with the idea that prior to this passage, um, Elijah was asked by God, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord."
Mhm.
Exactly what you read. And then you read the actual passage, and the bottom end of that passage, God said again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And then Elijah says, word for word, everything he had just said. And so, folks, if you thought that Alex was quoting Elijah before he read the passage, it's because it repeats,
Yeah.
and it's identical. There is something, I think, unique about this of Elijah has been through all this. He's in a mountain. There was a wind, a hurricane, that broke um, stones and had them fall down and break on each other. He went through an earthquake. He went through a wildfire, and then he went through silence. And Elijah came out unchanged, right?
Yeah.
The same thing it said. I,
Yeah.
I, and it still bewilders me as to why that is. Do you have any idea of why he didn't change what he said?
Um, what I want to say that I think the reason he remained unchanged is because we have to be receptive to the presence of God.
Hmm.
If we're still in the mode of what we're thinking and the problems that we're facing and all those things, we're not going to be receptive to God. So it's kind of like Elijah had his nap, he had some food, it didn't change anything. He
Hmm.
was still in the same mindset.
Hmm.
And the other thing that I would say is for people who are going to be preaching about this Sunday, the question I might be grappling with is saying, how is it that we expect God to come to us? How is it that we expect God to show up in our lives, in our ministry, in our relationships, whatever you want to say?
Hmm.
Because if we expect one way and God doesn't do it, then we're prone to say, well, God just doesn't exist or God doesn't care.
Well, we will flip flop between two things. Um, why did God allow for earthquakes, wildfires, hurricanes?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, or God doesn't exist, right? That we have these two bad dichotomies of either God exists and God does these horrible things through nature to God's people,
Yeah.
or God doesn't exist at all, and that's clearly not it. I'm going to take a entirely different approach with
Go
Elijah
for it.
this year, um, and part of that is because of the hurricane season that Longboat Key and the rest of our region. I mean, not just us. That what we went through, and it's still. You want to talk about an aorist tense? That those three storms, three hurricanes, uh, are still affecting us today, psychologically speaking. That the storms aren't here, but there's still this remnant of having to deal with that. um, so one way to look at Elijah is to say his faith in the Lord was so strong that he can go through the windstorm, the earthquake, the firestorm, and even the silence of like nothing from God, nothing from God's nature, nothing. He can go through all of that because he knows the Lord isn't in it. And so for us, like this past Sunday, Paul was writing to the church in Rome, and I think Paul's writing directly to you and me about saying, when we receive God's grace, this is no fairy tale. They lived happily ever after.
Right.
Once you receive God's grace, you still have sufferings, but we rejoice. We boast in our sufferings because sufferings produces endurance. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and this hope never disappoints. And so it is like he's describing Elijah, that Elijah has been through a lot of disappointments and suffering, and it has produced in him this character that he can go through all this stuff, and yet he's still the same guy. It doesn't change him because the Lord's not in it. And somehow, when he heard the silence, there then came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing?" That he knew the voice of the Lord.
From a practical standpoint, when we talk about
Second,
prayer,
I have to
oh,
fix my curtain. It's a sunny day on the island today. There we go.
Kurt illuminated you for just a moment.
Oh, it
Um,
was.
when we talk about the practice of prayer, one
Mhm,
of the things that I remember learning from a wise and learned priest who'd been praying longer than I'd been alive was that silence in the presence of God frightens us,
mhm,
but it's the silence that God uses to draw us in
mhm,
and test us a bit. Because, and this happens when we're starting to grow in our faith. So early on in our relationship with God, we're hearing a lot of things. We're hearing God's voice often very clearly. We're understanding things. When we start to deepen our faith, that voice starts to get a little quieter because I think God is asking us to listen more closely. But also, it's as if to say, I want you to deepen your sense of my presence, that it's not always when I'm talking, that I can also be in the absence of talking. But this is where it falls apart for a lot of people. I know it sometimes falls apart for me, is that if I don't feel like I'm hearing God clearly, then
mhm.
I'm just saying, well, God's just not there. God's
Right,
not hearing my prayers, you know.
right.
So I think this is also a good thing to talk about as preachers, when we're talking to our congregation, saying, if you don't hear God's voice in your life, it's either because A, you're talking too much and he can't get a word in edgewise, B, you're not paying attention, or C, you really have strayed so far away from the voice that you need to turn around and go back.
Mhm. I'm going to add a couple more onto that, which I
Well,
think
those are
is I
just
think
three.
is
I,
great.
I wanted I
Um,
wanted to leave some for you.
well, I thank you. I appreciate that. In music, Tchaikovsky and several others
Hmm.
uses pause or uses silence that and I've been in orchestras where we're playing these very loud pieces that suddenly everything comes to a head and stops,
Yeah.
and there's silence, and the silence sounds louder than all 120 instruments, right?
Yeah.
That suddenly when the sound is taken away, the silence just whammo hits, and then you restart. So there's that image. The other image in the Episcopal Church, uh, you will find in our prayer book, and then for those of us like us who print large print in bulletins, so people can actually read it, that we put in the words that say silence, because in our culture, if there's a pause, we want to fill it with something. And
Hmm.
so we specifically instruct in our liturgies, there will be silence. And one of those silent moments came when our friend Bill Party was ordained to the priesthood. And Bishop Scharf tells everybody, especially the clergy, because we all stand up around. Have you seen the picture that Bill
Oh my
posted
God, it's
on?
wonderful.
I
It's
love
wonderful.
that picture. It's
Yeah.
somehow there's this aerial view of all of the tradition in the Episcopal Church is that the person being ordained to the priesthood kneels in front of the bishop, and the bishop puts his hands on the head of the one being ordained, and then the priests only, although a couple of bishops snuck in, but we reach our hands forward and lay hands on him, and if we can't get to him, we lay hands on each other, and it's this beautiful picture of everybody bowing down, putting their hands on each other, and praying. But Bishop Scharf had said I have silence, and it's intentional silence. And he waited, and that because we sing this hymn, everybody gets arranged. There's a lot of energy in the room,
And then
and
there's
then silence. And it reminds me of this sheer silence, and that within that quiet moment, that's either when we hear God speaking or we're just sitting in God's presence, and we don't have to say anything. God doesn't have to say anything. We just get to be together.
and I think this really comes to the heart of something that I know I struggle with, which is reminding myself that to be with God is to be in relationship. And the healthiest relationships are when you can sit in the room with somebody and be silent.
Hmm.
You know, you can be in the room with somebody, but you don't have to fill the noise. You don't have to fill the room with noise. You don't have to fill the room with this nervous conversation talking about nothing. Um, you know, it's important. And so if I'm preaching the Sunday, which I'm not, I'm still up here in Sewanee, but if I was preaching the Sunday, I would challenge people, call on people to ask, what is your relationship to silence? What is your relationship to being able to sit down and be quiet? And of course, we live in a world where that is almost impossible. And it's being like driven into us to always be saying something or listening to something or being engaged in something that causes noise.
Always have the TV on.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I am so guilty of always having music playing.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So for those who preach with their lives, and for those who also preach on Sunday, there is a measure of silence that is so important when we're dealing with somebody who is expressing deep sorrow or grief or something that they've never told anybody else, that we want to fill that gap with sound. And especially if our friend who we're meeting with starts to tear up and starts to cry. Um, and one of the things that I was taught in clinical pastoral education, and I'm sure you were taught the same thing, is that when somebody starts to cry, our first inclination is to touch them and then to say something. And that we are taught to sit there and be quiet. Do not touch them and let them work it out. Because if you touch somebody, it will bring them out of their crying state, and that they need to be in that state. When they look up at you, that is when you can touch them on the arm, on the hand, and let them know that they aren't alone. But you have to wait for them to look up. Let the silence enfold. Um,
Well, and I think that's what happened to Elijah. He encountered the angel of the Lord who was letting him work it out. Work
yeah.
out your grief about this, work out your anxiety, work out your fatigue
Hmm.
about these things while you are being accompanied by the presence of God in this angel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I agree completely with you that we have to be careful. We need to let people work things out. But God also does that. You can be in the same room as somebody, comforting them in complete silence and not
Hmm.
touching them because they know that if they do reach out,
Hmm.
that you are there.
Hmm.
And I think that is a powerful statement that we can make in our prayer to
Hmm.
say, Lord, I know that you're there. You may not be saying anything overtly, but even in your silence, you are saying that you are here.
Right.
And that
Yep.
takes deep
Yep.
faith.
It takes deep faith. It also silence doesn't work in a podcast. And so what Alex and I are exhibiting right now is not what we're inviting you to do. What
No.
we are inviting to do in about 5, 6 minutes, if you were to take your headphones out or pause whatever device you're listening to
Mhm.
and sit there in silence for a few minutes. Obviously not during this podcast, but as soon as it's over, to practice that silence. My Jewish friends have a tradition, and that is when somebody passes, you go over to their house for the loved ones and the family members,
And
and you
sit Shiva.
sit.
Yeah, sit Shiva.
Yes, and you sit and you are silent.
Mhm.
Um, and for I have some Jewish friends, and they are very talkative, and I love it. But to sit in a room with them and to say nothing is saying everything. Right? It's so.
I
So
don't,
powerful.
not to cast any shade, I don't think that would be a practice within my culture. We talk too much. We have to fill that silence with as many words as possible whenever somebody dies. We just cannot help ourselves.
Right. Well,
So, kind
yeah.
of coming back to the last part here, when we begin to think about putting this into practice, what might that look like?
Mhm.
What that might look like is doing something that I know my wife cannot stand, and she does not understand why I do this, which is when I'm in the car, there are times I don't turn the radio on.
You bet. Yeah. Yep.
Especially if I've come from a retreat or like a kind of very intense spiritual moment, I kind of leave all the sound off to see if God is going to talk to me in that silence.
Mhm.
But the practice of the presence of silence, or the presence of God in silence, is a very strong spiritual exercise. So don't try to do it all at once. That if you can just take 30 seconds of
Mhm.
silence and try
Mhm.
several times a day, that will transform how you feel God is present for you and actually how you are present for yourself.
Mhm. One of my favorite stories about Sigmund Freud is that he would sit down with his tablet and his pipe, and the patient would be there, and he wouldn't say anything.
Yeah.
He would just let the silence work. And he found that the longer he's silent, the more that that person will eventually get to why they're sitting in his office. That instead of asking all these leading questions and that type of stuff, he learned just be quiet, and the guy gal will get to what they need to speak to.
I had a spiritual director like that. And it was when I first started the practice of spiritual direction, which is sitting with a priest or a layperson who has been trained to guide you in discernment and prayer and, how is it
Mhm.
with your soul, etc. Um, it was absolutely unnerving to me to sit in that silence, but they were going to let me break it. They were not going to break the silence. And so now it's a little bit easier. I'm not saying it's not unnerving at all. It still sometimes it is a challenge. But once again, this is what it means to grow in our spiritual life. And that's what this green season is about. This season after Pentecost is now we are growing into faith and love and the practices that we're called to do.
You bet. For those who are lectors for Sunday, those who are reading this passage out loud to their church, I would invite you when you're practicing to read the first part of what Elijah says. I've been very zealous for the Lord. I alone am left. The first time you read it, use a different tone of voice. Use one that's very rushed or angry or exhausted. And then the second time you read it differently. It's the same words, but it would indicate that something different is going on inside of Elijah. So try not to repeat yourself. Try that different step of um, of changing it. Also, when there's silence,
Pause.
when it says that there's silence, there's a sound of sheer silence. Pause
Pause just for a couple seconds. Just
just for a second. Then
pause.
say, when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face and went out. Right. That have if you have the joy of being able to lecture this Sunday, have fun with this passage. Dig into it. Take your time. Tell the story. It's great.
Well, Dave, I'm glad for the stories that we're telling, especially when we get to share stuff about the greatest prophet, as it were,
Sure.
and keep
What
looking for. Yeah, yeah.
if you were to wrap this up by saying, "What's the good news of this passage?" What is one thing that you would say is good news from this?
I would say what the good news in this parish is that God is in the silence.
Mhm.
So don't be afraid of the silence.
Yeah. And silence can happen. We can, like Jesus said, close the door, turn off the radio, although he didn't say turn off the radio, but the sense of go into a quiet place, shut the door, sit in silence. God is with you.
So as we come to the end of our time, it's don't forget during the summer we're still doing this. We're still doing the podcast. We're still going through the green season, and we're still going to be working through these wonderful stories of prophets and gospel. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And wherever we are, be there on a mountain or by a beach, we'll catch you in the next one.
God bless.